12th part of the excerpt from Lesson 01 of the online philosophy course by Professor Olavo de Carvalho on March 14, 2009. Student asks, what is consciousness? Actually, how is it formed? Would you say it is a reflection of socially constituted value, or is it something proper and intrinsic to each person? Olavo answers, we will see in the course. I'm not going to answer anything for you, you will discover it. I will give you hints, but it's you who will find the answer. Note well, in this course it is not my role to give answers, but rather to articulate the questions, also because I cannot foresee if some of you might find a much better answer than those I have found to the questions I am raising. It could be that there are half a dozen geniuses here who discover a lot of things. My business here is not to teach you a ready-made philosophy, but to teach you the philosophical technique and put you in a position to be able to carry out the entire investigation. It's not that I don't have my own convictions, nor that I don't respect them. Nowadays people say, I have my idea, but I respect yours. But, well, if I have my idea it is precisely because I do not respect yours. If I don't think my idea is better than yours, why do I say this is my idea? To have an idea means to think it is better than the others. How is it possible for me to have an idea if I think it's worth as much as the opposing idea? If I think two ideas are equally valid, either I don't believe in either of them or I'm in doubt. This means that every person who says they have their own ideas but respects the opposing ideas of others is a hypocrite. Sincerity would be to say that you respect the right others have to say whatever nonsense they want, but that you think you are right and others are wrong. Regarding consciousness, a few days ago I wrote an article about it. Consciousness without consciousness, Diario do Comercio, March 13, 2009. There are two currents here in the USA that keep discussing the subject. One believes that the brain produces consciousness, and its followers don't admit that they have no idea how the brain does that, and the other says that no brain is needed. According to the latter, consciousness would be like a computer program, software that you can put on various different hardware without making the slightest difference. But then why don't they take consciousness out of brain hardware and put it into another? Because it's impossible. I don't know what these two currents are talking about. Now, I have a criterion regarding this problem of consciousness. Consciousness is the only entity of which you cannot speak in its absence. For example, I can talk about elephants without elephants being here, I can talk about republic even if I live in a monarchy, or vice versa, I can talk about a crime without the criminal being present, and without me committing any crime, but I can never talk about consciousness without exercising my consciousness at this very moment. And if I talk about consciousness, I am talking about my consciousness, which is active at this very moment, and being active means precisely that you are aware of it. That is, consciousness is something that is always conscious of itself. So, when they say they will investigate the nature of consciousness, in fact they will only investigate the supposed causes of consciousness. But we cannot discover the causes of something we do not even know what it is. On the other hand, through exercise and the continuous contemplation of consciousness by consciousness, you end up knowing what it is, and you end up realizing that the question about the cause of consciousness makes no sense. When I talk about my consciousness, I know I have to be conscious at this very moment. My consciousness intensifies when I reason and reflect upon it. At that moment, I am not only conscious of certain things but also conscious of being conscious of them. And this, in a way, casts an even brighter light on the object. This is not a conclusion, we know this directly from experience. Now, if I want to think about my consciousness but at the same time imagine it is produced by my brain, then I have already deviated from my consciousness and am thinking about neurons, synapses, etc. It so happens that neurons and synapses also function when you are not conscious, they have nothing to do with consciousness. This means that I cannot be conscious of myself and at the same time be imagining that this is a brain activity. Because the brain is a physical thing, you can hold it in your hand, it is not a cognitive activity. We say it is the seat of cognitive activity. But it itself is not a cognitive activity, so if you, when thinking about consciousness, start thinking about the brain, you immediately change the subject. You are no longer thinking about consciousness, but about the brain. You can even talk about consciousness at the same time that you regard it as brain activity, but you cannot represent your consciousness to yourself at the same instant that you reason about it as brain activity. This does not apply to other human activities. Imagine, for example, a person running while simultaneously thinking about the anatomy and physiology of the movement. Would that bother him? Not at all. The more conscious he is of the physical apparatus producing his movement, the better his movement will be and the more adequate his gestures. But in the case of consciousness, when you think about its physical substrate, you immediately drop down a level. Your consciousness, as an activity, ceases to be present to you. Only the physical substrate remains present, and your reflection on consciousness ends at that very moment. This is a basic technical difficulty. This criterion I'm giving regarding consciousness does not answer the question about the origin of consciousness. But it is a hint of a prerequisite condition without which this problem cannot be seriously investigated. Knowing and meeting the prerequisites is obviously a basic part of the philosophical method. In this case, what we did was to refer a theoretical question to the real experience of thinking about it. If Kant had done this when writing the Critique of Pure Reason, he would have given up writing a book for people who would only perceive its phenomenal appearance. Student asks, can the examination of conscience be done in the form of a diary? Olavo answers, yes, of course it can. It's just quite complicated because sometimes you don't have sufficient verbal and expressive tools to describe even to yourself your inner states and experiences. This is another thing I want to point out, for those who read my book about the theory of the four discourses, Aristotle in New Perspective, it should be clear that all human knowledge begins first as perception, then as memory and imagination, and only then stabilizes into verbalizable concepts about which you can reason. Knowledge implies a series of conversions from one thing to another. We cannot deal with the basic material of the senses because it is not transferable. If every time I had to talk about an elephant I needed to see one, I would have to have an elephant in my garden to look at it again. What we do is keep a schematic form in memory to which we give the name elephant, and then we reason about this term and the implicit concept as if they applied to a real elephant. Do they apply? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, because the concept of elephant is not made of the same matter that composes the elephant. The real entity has its own structure, its own real and effective composition, which cannot be fully transposed into a concept. Every elephant that exists, for example, is somewhere at every moment, but the concept of elephant is nowhere. To deal with the concept so that the conclusions obtained about it apply to a real elephant, you must always make a series of conversions, otherwise you will get lost in pure abstraction. You will create a definition, reason about it, and believe it applies to the object, but not only will the object have many other components that are not part of your definition, but the definition itself may also be wrong. This sense of the concrete and the abstract is a basic element of the philosophical method, and this is precisely what many people lack. People draw conclusions from sentences and believe they are talking about reality. Sentences are instruments for reasoning, but the connection between them and reality must be reassembled, and this sometimes requires many more sentences. Why do you lose things in the transposition from experience to concept? Because you did not express the experience correctly, you expressed it partially, truncated, or, worse yet, you immediately replaced it with a name. This means that expressing experience is the beginning of all human knowledge. One must seek to express experience based on memory, in such a way as to create a mental form that can be repeated as soon as the same words are heard. What is this? This is literary art. Without mastery of language in its literary use, there is nothing else. That is why education must begin with language and literature. Without that, it will not work. And when literature declines, everything declines. Hugo von Hofmannsthal said that nothing exists in the politics of a country if it is not first in its literature. Since there is nothing in current Brazilian literature, there is nothing in its politics either. Literature is the direct and most complete expression of the imagination. Other arts cannot achieve such a complete expression. The language in use in Brazil has undergone a series of changes that have transformed it into a contraption difficult to use for describing reality. Public language is so loaded with stereotypes, jargon, and slogans that it practically no longer serves to talk about reality, but only to express what you want the other person to think. These are the famous three functions of language by Carl Buehler: A. The nominative function, which is to name things and describe reality; B. The expressive function, which is to express your feelings and experiences; and C. The appellative function, which is language used to influence the other person's mind. In Brazil today, only the appellative function exists. Everyone only speaks to influence other people's minds. For at least 50 years, our literary production has not kept up with the real experience of people. Our literature no longer has anything to do with reality, and is practically formed only by stereotypes. The basic function of the writer, the literatus, the poet or the novelist is to put individual and collective experience at the disposal of the whole society, so that this experience becomes the basic material from which everything is discussed. This imaginary world is the first, simplest and most immediate synthesis made from experience. If you do not have this material, the concepts used in describing reality no longer reflect real experience. They sometimes reflect real experiences of other people's that you naively imagine to be similar to your own. So that if you reason from these concepts, you start talking about your neighbor believing you are talking about yourself. This is a cultural disaster of extraordinary proportions. This means that the students of this course, before wanting to restore a serious philosophical discussion in Brazil, need to restore Brazilian language, and therefore we will have to do a whole job of improving and developing our expressive language. Note well, this is not a literature course. A literature course aims to give the student a literary culture, teaching who are the poets of the Romantic period, what are the complete works of Machado de Assis, etc., and that is not what I am talking about. It is not about literary culture, but about mastering certain instruments of literary expression. Among the great writers, some had enormous literary culture, while others, although having little culture, were able to absorb sufficient instruments. Compared to Otto Maria Carpos, for example, who read the entire universal literature, some of our best novelists were almost uneducated. They had not read 1,000th of what Carpos read, but from that 1,000th they knew how to take advantage, because they were interested in exercising literary expression and not literary culture, as was the case with Carpos. Not that Carpos did not also master literary expression, he was a wonderful writer, but his essays are read less for their intrinsic literary qualities than for their scientific and teaching qualities. I will give some tips regarding language improvement, and the first one will seem extremely paradoxical. I said I would not indicate a book, but I will. It is Napoleão Mendes de Almeida's Latin Grammar. There is no book for teaching Portuguese, not even by Napoleão himself, comparable to what he did with Latin grammar. If you want to understand sentence structure, it is in this book that you will have to learn. There is no other book in the world where you can get this. I have read many Latin teaching books, and nothing compares to this one. The study of Latin, in our case, has the advantage that in Latin you only understand sentences if you decompose them into their constituent elements. In Latin, reading and syntactic analysis are the same, inseparably. Note that syntactic analysis is not the same as logical analysis. Understanding sentence structure is not understanding the structure of its reference in reality. But if you have no idea of sentence structure, you will not be able to transpose it to reality. You have 5 years to learn Napoleão Mendes de Almeida's Latin as the course proceeds, but the first parts of the book, which refer to the basic elements of the sentence, should be read as quickly as possible. Later, the absorption of Latin will also be important for the study of certain texts. Not that you need to read Latin fluently, but at least you must understand some sentence structure and vocabulary. There are concepts which, if you do not understand them in Latin or Greek, you will never understand. A minimum of Latin and Greek is indispensable, but the recommendation of this book is mainly to develop in you the sense of the material construction of sentences. Dante defined grammar as the material construction of sentences. There is a series of very subtle relationships between the material construction of the sentence and the underlying logical structure, and grasping these subtleties is extremely important for you to realize when you are being carried away by the dynamics of language and believing in certain sentences just because you were able to build them. In today's Brazil, language teaching is so bad that when someone manages to build a sentence, he has an orgasm, and starts believing the sentence just to give it value. This is one of the many traps we will have to learn to avoid. Develop a sense of sentence structure, find, beneath it, the underlying logical structure, and find, behind the logical structure, the perception of reality also underlying it. This is an exercise that nothing in the world can replace. The same elements you will learn in Latin grammar can be applied to practically any language in the world, because the elements that compose them are the same. Even if after reading Napoleon you do not know a word of Latin, you will still have understood what sentence structure is, and you will start to notice the ambiguities that exist in the transposition from grammatical structure to logical structure. From logical structure to perception structure, and from perception structure to reality structure. At first, you will not notice how it works, but I guarantee it will work. I assure you that this is the best Latin book ever written. There is nothing like it in any language, and it can only do good.